The galaxy's end came with Earth's warship's arrival. The alarm did not wake me. I had not slept. I had been sitting at my observation desk for 6 hours, staring at a single data point that refused to make sense. The sensors had picked it up at 0317 station time, a gravitational distortion in the outer rim of Sol sector, and every time I ran the numbers gave me back the same impossible answer. Something had moved through folded space, not along the standard hyperlane corridors. Not through any of the 17 approved transit pathways that the Galactic Accord had carefully maintained for 10,000 years. Something had cut its own path through the fabric of the universe, like a knife through paper, and arrived exactly where it intended to arrive. My name is Vrenkai. I am a senior observation analyst for the Galactic Accord, assigned to monitoring post Theta 9, which orbits in the outer dark at a comfortable distance from the yellow star humans call the Sun. I have held this post for 41 cycles, which translates to roughly 380 years in human measurement. I have watched 17 civilizations rise on their home planets in that time. I have watched 11 of them disappear before they ever reached the stars. I filed those extinction reports without losing sleep. The universe is efficient. Civilizations that cannot survive their own nature rarely deserve sympathy in the great ledger of history. I was very good at my job. I was careful, thorough, and I had never once filed an inaccurate report. My superiors at the Accord valued me because I did not dramatize. I did not reach for conclusions that the data did not support. I was a scientist, not a storyteller. That morning, the data supported only one conclusion, and it terrified me. I opened a new channel to the Accord's central relay and began speaking. My voice was steady. I had trained it to be steady in any circumstance, and I was proud of that training in that moment, because the rest of me was not steady at all. This is Senior Analyst Vrenkai, post Theta 9, filing an emergency observation report at 0341 station time. At 0317, sensors detected a non-standard gravitational event in the outer approach zone of Sol sector. After 6 hours of verification and recalculation, I am confident in the following assessment. The event was caused by a vessel of significant mass executing an unauthorized faster-than-light transit. The vessel did not use any known hyperlane pathway. It appears to have generated its own transit corridor, using a method not contained in any of the Accord's scientific records. The vessel has now come to a full stop at approximately 4 light minutes from the third planet of Sol. Initial mass readings suggest it is between 12 and 14 kilometers in length. I paused. My hand rested flat on my desk, and I noticed that it was shaking slightly. The vessel is broadcasting on all known frequencies simultaneously. It is using 847 documented languages, including 3 that the Accord has classified as extinct. The message is the same in all languages. It identifies the vessel as the Unscale Leviathan. It states that the vessel has arrived. There is no further content. I closed the channel and sat back in my chair. The universe felt different than it had an hour ago. Not physically different. The stars were still where they were supposed to be. The quiet hum of Theta 9's life support systems was the same gentle sound it had always been. But something had shifted in the way reality seemed to work, and I was experienced enough to understand that what had shifted was my assumption that I understood the shape of things. I had spent 41 cycles watching the third planet of Sol. I had done so, I now realized, the way one watches a campfire while sitting at a safe distance, with mild interest, with the comfortable certainty that the fire was contained, that the warmth was pleasant, and that nothing about it could reach you. The fire had just stood up and introduced itself. I pulled up the full broadcast feed and listened to all 847 versions of the message playing simultaneously in my headset. They were perfectly synchronized. The timing was precise to a degree that required either extraordinary computational power or an extremely long preparation period. Probably both. The message was calm. It was polite even. There was no aggression in the tone, no demands, no list of grievances. Just a name and a statement of arrival, delivered in every language anyone in the galaxy had ever spoken, including the languages of civilizations that humans should not have known existed, because the Accord had never made official contact with them. That detail kept pulling at me. 3 extinct languages. The Accord had classified them as extinct because the civilizations that used them had been quietly guided toward less disruptive development paths. That was the official language in the records. Guided. It was a comfortable word. It did not describe the reality of what had happened to those three civilizations, but it was the word the records used, and records are how institutions remember things, in the way they prefer to remember them. Humans should not have known those languages. Humans should not have had any contact with those civilizations, which had existed before humanity developed writing, let alone radio signals. The fact that the Leviathan was broadcasting in those languages meant that at some point, through some method, humanity had found and read the Accord's private records. That thought made me set down my datapad very slowly and stare at the wall for a long time. I was still staring at the wall when the second alert came in, then the third. Within an hour, 17 different Accord monitoring posts had filed emergency reports. Within 2 hours, the Accord's High Council had convened an emergency session for the first time in 300 cycles. Within 3 hours, the session had devolved into something that my translation matrix rendered as shouting, which was unusual for a body composed of species with 11 different primary communication methods. The Leviathan sat in space and waited with perfect patience. I began to pull historical files, because that is what I do when I am frightened. I organize information. I build a picture from the pieces. I had 41 cycles of observation logs on Sol 3, and I started reading them in reverse order, beginning with the most recent and working backward, looking for the moment I had missed something. I found the first flag at cycle 37, 4 years before I arrived at this post. My predecessor, an analyst named Duvess-Orr, had noted an unusual energy signature from Sol's asteroid belt. The signature was consistent with early-stage fusion reactor testing. Duvess-Orr had logged it and attached a low-priority classification because humans were not supposed to have fusion reactor technology at that point. They had just achieved reliable fission energy and were considered at least 200 years from fusion capability by standard developmental models. Duvess-Orr had filed the note and apparently not followed up. There was no second report on the subject. I spent a moment thinking about what that meant, and then I went further back. At cycle 31, a different analyst had noted unusual gravitational readings from a region of the outer asteroid belt, logged as potential natural seismic activity. No follow-up. At cycle 28, there were records of anomalous radio signal patterns that did not match any known human communication standard, logged as interference. No follow-up. At cycle 19, there was a note from a routine scan that indicated a significant reduction in the total mass of certain asteroid clusters in the main belt. The analyst had attributed it to natural redistribution. No follow-up. I sat with these files arranged in front of me on my display, looking at them the way you look at pieces of a picture that has been sitting on your desk for years, and suddenly you understand what it shows. Humanity had been building something in the asteroid belt for at minimum 350 years. They had done it in pieces, in stages, in ways that individually looked like noise and together formed a pattern that should have been impossible to miss. Every single flag had been noted. Every single flag had been given a low-priority classification, and no follow-up action, because humans were not a threat. That was the category in the Accord system. Third planet of Sol. Sol sector. Species designation. Homo sapiens. Threat classification. Negligible. Pre-spaceflight for most of recorded observation history. Self-destructive tendencies. Internal resource conflicts. High probability of self-termination before achieving interstellar capability. Not worth significant monitoring resources. The Accord had looked at a species that was rapidly, systematically, and with extraordinary patience rebuilding its entire civilization's industrial base in hidden locations, and had filed it under negligible because that was where the category system said it belonged. I thought about this for a while. Then I pulled up the current sensor feed from the Leviathan. It was extraordinary. Even from this distance, the readings told a story. The vessel was built with materials that my instruments did not fully recognize. Parts of it appeared to be constructed from alloys with atomic structures that did not occur naturally, which meant that humans had not only figured out how to mine and refine asteroid materials at enormous scale, they had figured out how to engineer matter at the molecular level. The ship's power signature was immense and extremely stable, which indicated a reactor design that had not just worked the first time, but had been refined and perfected through extensive testing. The point defense grid that I could identify along the hull was dense to a degree I had never seen on any military vessel in the Accord's fleet records. It was built for an environment where threats came from multiple directions at extremely high velocities. Space. Open space. An environment where conflict would involve objects moving at fractions of the speed of light, where reaction time was measured in milliseconds, and where missing a single incoming projectile could end everything. Humanity had not built a ship for diplomatic missions. They had not built a ship for exploration. They had built a ship for war, and they had built it to survive wars that nothing in the known galaxy had yet figured out how to fight. The emergency council session was still ongoing. I could see the summary feeds coming through the central relay. 11 of the Accord's 32 member species had proposed immediate military response. 7 had proposed immediate diplomatic contact. 9 had proposed quarantine. 5 were arguing about procedural matters that seemed, from my position, to be entirely beside the point. Nobody had proposed listening to what the humans were actually saying, which was nothing yet, beyond their arrival announcement. Nobody had proposed trying to understand what 40 years of ignored sensor anomalies might mean about what was sitting in orbit around the third planet of Sol. Nobody seemed to be asking the most important question, which was why, of all the things humanity could have sent as their first vessel into galactic space, they had chosen to send one named after a creature from Earth mythology that was said to exist at the bottom of the deepest ocean, so enormous and so patient that most people forgot it was there until the day it decided to rise. I opened a new file. I labeled it, Things We Should Have Known, and chose not to. Then I started writing, because somebody needed to, and it was clear that nobody else was going to do it. The Leviathan had been in our sector for 11 hours when I finished the first draft. It was 214 pages. It covered every missed observation, every low-priority classification, every unfollowed flag across 40 cycles of monitoring data. It covered the 3 extinct language broadcasts and what they implied about humanity's access to Accord private records. It covered the mass estimates for the materials removed from the asteroid belt and what those estimates suggested about the total number and size of vessels that might have been constructed. I read it through once. Then I filed it to the emergency council session as a priority attachment. The council's response came back 40 minutes later. A single line from the session coordinator. Report received. Under review. Analyst Vren Kai to maintain observation post and await further instructions. I sat back in my chair and looked at the stars through my observation window. The Leviathan sat where it had been sitting since it arrived, still, patient, broadcasting its simple message on all frequencies in all languages, repeating every 30 minutes with the same calm precision. A ship that size, sitting that still, in that location, was an act of deliberate communication. It was not hiding. It was not positioning for tactical advantage. It was doing the one thing that the Accord had apparently never expected from a species classified as self-destructive and likely to collapse before reaching the stars. It was waiting. The Accord had interceptors. Standard military doctrine called for a perimeter vessel to challenge any unauthorized arrival, demand identification, and escort or remove the vessel from restricted space. 3 Accord patrol vessels were already positioned within response distance of Sol Sector. I could see them on the long-range map, small lights, sitting at the edge of what they considered a safe approach distance. None of them had moved in 11 hours. The Accord's military doctrine, I realized, had been written for situations where the intruding vessel was smaller, slower, or less armed than the patrol vessels sent to challenge it. It had never been written for a situation where the math very clearly said that the vessel you were supposed to challenge could do things to your patrol group that polite scientific language did not have good words for. A message arrived on my private channel. Not from the Accord. From a colleague of mine, an analyst named Fessa Ran, who worked the monitoring post covering a different sector, but had access to the same emergency feeds. "Are you watching the Leviathan's broadcast pattern?" the message said. "Look at the timing intervals between repetitions. They are not random." I pulled up the timing data and looked at it. Fessa Ran was correct. The 30-minute intervals were not exactly 30 minutes. They varied by tiny fractions of a second in a pattern that, when mapped visually, produced a sequence. I stared at the sequence for a long moment, and then I understood what I was looking at. It was a count. The humans were counting something. I worked backwards through the pattern, and realized the count had started from the moment of their arrival. They were not just announcing themselves. They were timing something, an interval, a deadline. I did not know what happened when the count reached 0. I was not certain I wanted to know. But I also recognized, with the quiet certainty that comes from 41 cycles of careful observation, that whatever happened when that count reached 0, the Accord had spent 11 hours arguing about procedure and filing review requests, instead of doing the one thing that might have changed the outcome. Nobody had simply asked the humans what they wanted. I looked at the Leviathan on my sensor feed, 14 kilometers of patient, silent, impossibly advanced machinery, sitting in space and counting down to something, in a sector that the Accord had written off as home to a negligible, self-destructive, pre-spaceflight species that would probably never amount to anything worth worrying about. I opened my personal log and made a note. It said, "We have made a very large error. I do not yet know how large, but I think we are about to find out." Then I closed my log, poured myself a cup of the hot liquid I used to stay awake during long observation shifts, and went back to watching. The count kept going. Outside, the Leviathan waited. And in the Accord's emergency council session, 11,000 light-years away, important beings with important titles argued about who had the authority to authorize a preliminary communication request, while the clock ticked toward whatever the humans had decided was the right moment for the conversation to begin. I had been doing this job for 41 cycles. I had watched 17 civilizations. I had filed 11 extinction reports. And sitting in that chair, with my untouched drink going cold beside me, I had the very clear and very unwelcome feeling that for the first time in my career, I was watching history happen, and that the report I would eventually file about this day would be read by beings who had not yet been born, in a galaxy that might look very different from the one I was currently sitting in. That thought should have frightened me more than it did. Mostly, I was just very curious about what happened next. The files were ancient. Not ancient in the way that ruins are ancient, worn smooth and empty by time. Ancient the way that something locked in a vault is ancient, perfectly preserved and untouched because no one with the authority to open it had ever wanted to. I found them at 0612 station time, 14 hours after the Leviathan's arrival, and for 3 hours I sat very still and read them, and when I was done reading them, I understood that what had arrived in Sol Sector was not a surprise. Not really. It was a result. A very logical, very patient, very human result of decisions the Accord had made across more than 1,000 years, and had then buried under careful language in files that nobody was supposed to need to look at. The council session was still running. The 3 patrol vessels near Sol Sector still had not moved. The Leviathan still had not moved. The count embedded in its broadcast timing was still running, and I had calculated that it would reach 0 in approximately 14 hours. I had filed this calculation to the council. I had received no response. I was beginning to understand that the council was not going to respond in any meaningful way before the count reached 0, because the council was an institution, and institutions do not move quickly, when moving quickly would require them to acknowledge that something had gone fundamentally, historically wrong. The files I found were observation records from a period beginning roughly 1,200 years ago. They had been archived in a secondary storage layer that required a senior analyst clearance level to access, which I had, though I had never used it to search these particular directories before. The files were from a monitoring period that the official Accord historical record described as the Sol Sector Developmental Observation Phase, which was a very calm and scientific-sounding name for what the files actually described. The first file that stopped me was from 860 years ago. It was a strategic assessment commissioned by what was then the Accord's Developmental Management Division, a body that no longer existed under that name, but whose functions had been absorbed into the current Strategic Resources Directorate. The assessment was titled Sol 3 Trajectory Review, and it was remarkably direct in its language, in a way that official documents usually were not, which told me it had been written for internal use only, and never intended for any record that might one day be made public. The assessment said, in its opening section, that humanity represented a high-probability accelerated development case. It said that left without intervention, humanity's naturally rapid technological iteration cycle, combined with its demonstrated capacity for large-scale industrial organization under crisis conditions, placed it on a trajectory to achieve interstellar capability within 400 to 600 years. It said that humanity's biological and psychological characteristics, specifically a high tolerance for individual risk, an extremely strong in-group protective instinct, that could scale to the level of species-wide solidarity under external threat, and an unusual capacity for what the document called productive stubbornness in the face of obstacles, made it a candidate for what the document called an accelerated threat reclassification. The document then recommended a program of subtle developmental interference, not elimination. The Accord was never comfortable with direct language about elimination, which was one of its most persistent institutional qualities. The program would involve occasional guidance of key human decisions, quiet suppression of certain research directions that were developing too quickly, and the management of certain resource availability situations to ensure that humanity's attention remained focused on internal matters rather than outward expansion. The program was approved. A division was created to implement it. The division operated for 400 years before being formally dissolved, at which point its functions were transferred to existing monitoring operations and became simply a standard part of how Sol sector was observed and managed. I put the document down and thought about this for a while. Then I picked it up again and kept reading, because there was more, and it was worse. 200 years after the management program began, a field analyst stationed closer to Sol had filed an alert. She noticed that certain human industrial developments had not slowed as the program predicted they should. They had slowed slightly, then resumed, then accelerated to a pace faster than the original projections. The analyst's name was Paris Dale, and her report was 20 pages of careful, detailed, alarmed documentation. She concluded that humanity had identified the interference pattern, not the specific mechanism, not the Accord specifically. But they had looked at their own developmental history and noticed that certain doors kept closing slightly before they reached them, and that certain resource situations resolved in ways that benefited the slowing of their expansion, and they had begun quietly working around these patterns without ever confirming what was causing them. The Accord's response to Paris Dale's report had been to transfer her to a different sector and increase the intensity of the management program. Her follow-up reports from her new posting were not relevant to Sol sector, but I looked them up anyway. Her final professional assessment, written shortly before she retired from observation work, contained a line that I read 3 times. A civilization that teaches itself to navigate around obstacles it cannot see will eventually learn to navigate around all obstacles. Nobody had followed up on that assessment either. 140 years later, a different analyst flagged unusual activity in the Sol system's outer asteroid belt. Gravitational anomalies, mass reductions in certain clusters, energy readings that did not match any natural process. I had seen this in my own backward review of the files. Now I was seeing it in historical context, and the context made it much more significant, because this flag had not simply received a low-priority classification and been left alone. This flag had been seen by someone in the Strategic Resources Directorate, and a specific decision had been made to classify it as natural activity and seal the original report. Someone had looked at evidence that humanity was quietly beginning large-scale construction in its asteroid belt and had made the active choice to mark the file as unimportant and hide the original observation. That was not negligence. That was a decision, a conscious, deliberate decision made by someone who understood what the reading probably meant and chose not to pursue it, for reasons that the record did not fully explain, but that I could reconstruct without much difficulty. If the reading meant what it appeared to mean, the management program had failed. If the management program had failed, the division responsible for running it would need to answer questions. If those questions were answered honestly, the entire framework by which the Accord had justified its management of developing civilizations for the past several centuries would come under scrutiny. If that framework came under scrutiny, very many powerful individuals and institutions would face very uncomfortable moments. So the file was sealed. The reading was reclassified, and the asteroid belt continued doing what the asteroid belt was doing, which was providing the raw materials for a construction project of historic scale, while the Accord looked carefully in other directions. I found the record of the Kepler colony incident at the bottom of a file set that had been archived in a way that required 3 separate authorization overrides to access, even with my clearance. I had to invoke an emergency research protocol to unlock it, and I made a note in my own logs of the exact time and method I used, because I wanted there to be a clear record of how I found it, and that I had found it legitimately. The Kepler colony had been an early human attempt at an off-world settlement. The effort had been remarkable by any standard. Humanity had not yet achieved reliable interstellar travel, but they had pushed hard into their own solar system and established a sustainable habitat on one of their outer planetary moons. It was a small settlement, but it had been thriving. 5,000 humans, building something new, in a place that nothing like them had ever lived before. The settlement had failed. The official history, the one included in standard Accord educational materials about developing civilizations, described it as a casualty of early human colonization technology, a combination of equipment failure and resource miscalculation that was common in first-generation off-world settlements. A tragedy, a setback, one of the natural difficulties that all civilizations faced when first reaching beyond their home planet. The file behind 3 authorization overrides told a different story. An Accord field agent had been operating near the Kepler colony, not observing, operating. There had been a series of small interventions, carefully timed, targeting the colony's most critical systems. A power regulation component failed in an unusual way. A water reclamation cycle produced readings that led to the shutdown of a secondary filtration system at exactly the wrong time. A communication relay experienced interference that prevented a distress call from being received clearly. None of these things, individually, looked like anything other than bad luck and equipment problems. Together, in sequence, they had produced conditions that no settlement could survive. The field report described the outcome with the same clinical detachment that I recognized from hundreds of other official documents. Settlement dissolution, personnel loss, recovery recommendation. The report noted that the intervention had successfully reset humanity's off-world expansion timeline by an estimated 40 to 60 years. I set down that file and did not move for a long time. I had filed 11 extinction reports in 41 cycles. I had not grieved for the civilizations in those reports. I had looked at the data, written the words, and moved on. I told myself that this was because I was a scientist, and science required detachment from outcomes. I had believed this about myself. Sitting with that file, I was not certain I had been right. 5,000 humans had died in the Kepler colony. They had died in a settlement they had built with their own hands, in conditions that their ancestors would have called impossible, as part of a reaching outward toward the stars that was the most natural expression of what humanity was. And they had died because someone in an Accord division had decided that humanity's expansion timeline needed to be adjusted, and had made the specific technical decisions required to produce that adjustment, and had then filed a report describing the outcome in the language of institutional management. The report had been written by someone with a name and a posting and a clearance level, someone who had gone home after filing it and done whatever they did at the end of their work cycles, someone who had continued their career, someone who had probably, at some point, received a performance commendation. The file said the intervention had been authorized at the directorate level. It had been reviewed and approved. It had been executed within Accord operational parameters. None of that made it something that could be described with the word guidance, and yet guidance was the word that appeared in every higher-level summary of the management program's activities during that period. I understood something then that I had not fully understood before. I understood why, when the Leviathan broadcast on all 847 frequencies, it had chosen to include 3 extinct languages. Not because humanity wanted to show off what they knew, because humanity wanted the Accord to know, from the very first moment of contact, that humanity had read the files, all of them, including the ones behind 3 authorization overrides. And the count was still running. I opened a new document. I started writing the report that I knew the Council would not want to receive. I wrote it anyway, because someone needed to, and because sitting in that chair with those files surrounding me, I had become very clear on one thing. Whatever the Leviathan represented, and whatever happened when the count reached 0, the Accord had not been blindsided by a civilization that came out of nowhere. The Accord had watched very carefully, intervened very deliberately, and buried the evidence very thoroughly. And now, 14 kilometers of patient, perfectly engineered consequence was sitting in space, outside the third planet of Sol, waiting for whatever came next, with a stillness that I found, despite everything, quietly extraordinary. Humanity had not sent a distress call. They had not sent an ambassador. They had not sent a diplomat or a scientist or a message of peace. They had sent a warship, and the warship was not threatening anyone. It was simply there, the way a very large and very calm person can simply stand in a doorway, and the doorway becomes suddenly much smaller than it was before. I filed my report. I received no response. The count ran. 14 hours after I found those files, it reached 0. The Leviathan spoke for the first time in a way that was not a broadcast loop. A direct channel opened, aimed specifically at the Accord's central communication array, in the Accord's primary administrative language, with a pronunciation precision that indicated the speaker had spent a very long time learning to speak it correctly. The voice was human, female, calm in a way that was not the calm of someone who was not afraid, but the calm of someone who had decided that what they were about to do was necessary, and had made their peace with that decision long before today. She said 7 words. She said, "We have read your field reports." Then, the channel closed. And nothing in the galaxy was the same as it had been before those 7 words. Commander Nora Calloway had been awake for 31 hours. She did not feel tired. She had trained herself out of feeling tired in the years when tiredness was a luxury she could not afford, in the years after Kepler, when she had understood for the first time what kind of universe she was living in, and what kind of person she needed to become to do something about it. She stood at the forward observation window of the Leviathan's bridge and looked at the stars. And the stars looked the way stars always look to someone standing on a ship that exists because of a decision made 30 years ago by a council of determined people who had all read the same classified files and arrived at the same quiet conclusion. The stars were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. The universe that surrounded them had turned out to be something different from beautiful, and it had taken a very long time, and a very great deal of work, to reach the point where that was something humanity could respond to, rather than simply endure. Lieutenant Owen Hart stepped up beside her. He was young for his rank, 29 by the civilian calendar, with the kind of focused stillness that came from years of working in environments where a moment of unfocused attention could end everything. He handed her a report screen without speaking. She took it without looking away from the window. "The Accord's 3 patrol vessels are still holding position," she said. "Yes, Commander," Owen said. "They have not moved in 32 hours. They are trying to decide whether we are a threat." "I believe so." "We are not a threat," Nora said. "We are a consequence. There is a difference, though I am not certain the distinction will be immediately clear to them." She finally looked down at the report screen. It was a summary of the Accord's Council session communications that their signals team had been monitoring since arrival. The Council had been running for 32 hours. They had changed their main agenda item 11 times. They had 3 times called for a vote on a military response option, and 3 times failed to achieve the necessary consensus to authorize it. The vote tallies were included in the summary, and Nora read them carefully. 11 species in favor of immediate military response. They were the Accord's dominant member groups, the ones who had the most to lose from what the Leviathan represented. 7 species in favor of diplomatic contact. 9 species abstaining or requesting additional time. 5 species raising procedural objections. Nora read the abstentions more carefully. 9 species. She knew which 9 they were. She had studied the Accord's internal politics for 8 years in preparation for this mission, and she knew the political map of the galaxy better than most of the beings who had been living in it for centuries. The 9 abstaining species were not confused. They were watching. They were waiting to see which way the situation moved before they committed themselves, because they were species who had spent a very long time being careful about which side of a conflict they appeared to be on, for very good historical reasons, that the Accord's official records did not discuss in detail, but that humanity's research had uncovered in full. "What is the status of the secondary fleet?" she asked. 14 vessels, Commander, all holding at the predetermined positions, all systems nominal, all crews standing by. Nora nodded. The secondary fleet was not visible from the Accord's monitoring posts. The Leviathan had arrived first and alone by design. You did not reveal everything in the opening moment. You gave the other party space to believe they understood the situation, and you waited to see what they did with that belief. And what they did told you a great deal about what came next. What the Accord had done was argue for 32 hours, which was, in its own way, informative. "Owen," she said. "Commander?" The 3rd abstaining vote, the one from the Sevra coalition. "Run the timing against our signal analysis again, and tell me what you find." Owen was quiet for a moment, working the calculation in his head, because Owen was the kind of person who could do that. Then he said, The Sevra representatives' abstention vote was cast approximately 14 minutes after our broadcast of the extinct language sequences. 14 minutes, Nora said. That is not a coincidence. No, Commander. The Sevra know at least one of those extinct languages. It appears so. Nora turned away from the window and walked back to her command station. The bridge of the Leviathan was not large by the standards of what most people imagined when they thought of a warship 14 kilometers long. It was efficient. Every station served a precise function. Every person on it had been placed there because they were the best available at what they did. There was no excess on the Leviathan. The ship had been built by people who understood that excess was a luxury reserved for those who did not have to justify every resource they used, and humanity had spent the better part of 3 centuries not having that luxury. She sat down and pulled up the live feed from the Accord monitoring post they had identified as Theta 9. Its signals had been interesting since the first hour. The analyst there, designation Vrenkai, had been very busy. His reports to the council had been thorough in a way that Nora recognized. It was the thoroughness of someone who was frightened of what they were seeing, but refused to look away from it, because looking away would be a kind of lie, and they did not like lying, even when the truth was very uncomfortable. The analyst at Theta 9, she said. Still transmitting reports to the council, Owen confirmed. We have been monitoring his output feed. His most recent report was filed 40 minutes ago. It included a complete historical analysis of the management program records, with specific reference to operational interventions dating back 800 years. Nora was quiet for a moment. He found the Kepler files. Yes, we believe so. She thought about that. He found them on his own, without being given a specific location? All available evidence suggests yes. He appears to have reconstructed the access path through cross-referencing anomalies in the historical record. Nora looked at the data profile on Vrenkai that her team had assembled over the past day. 41 cycles at Theta 9, 17 civilizations observed, 11 extinction reports filed. An unbroken record of accurate, thorough, careful work. A being who had spent most of his professional life not looking too closely at the things he was observing, not because he was careless, but because the framework he worked within had never asked him to look closely, and had actively discouraged the kind of questions that led to looking closely. And then something had arrived that made the framework impossible to maintain, and he had started asking questions anyway. I want a direct channel to Theta 9, she said. Owen looked at her. He was not the kind of person who questioned orders, but she could see the question forming behind his careful eyes. She understood it. Everything they had planned had been built around the central relay channel, around speaking to the council, around the political and strategic architecture of the Accord's power structure. Reaching out to a single analyst at an observation post was not in any planning document. He found the Kepler files on his own, she said again. In 32 hours, while the council was arguing, he filed a report about the management program that the council has not responded to. He has spent 41 cycles watching humanity, and apparently seeing us more clearly than any institution in the galaxy, which is an impressive achievement, given that his job was explicitly not to see us clearly. She paused. I want to talk to him. Owen turned to his station and began the process of establishing an encrypted direct channel. It took 4 minutes. Then he said, "Channel ready, Commander." Nora leaned forward slightly. She had rehearsed the message to the Accord Council many times in many forms over many years. She had never rehearsed this. She decided that was fine. Some conversations were better without preparation. Analyst Vrenkai, she said. My name is Nora Calloway. I am the commanding officer of the Unscale Leviathan. I have been reading your reports for the past 32 hours. I believe we should speak before the council makes a decision that would be very difficult to walk back from. There was a long pause. Long enough that Owen glanced at her, and she held up one hand to indicate patience. Then a voice came back. It was precise and controlled in the way that scientific training makes voices, and underneath the precision, there was something that Nora's translator matrix rendered as quiet astonishment. Commander Calloway, the voice said, I have a significant number of questions. I expected that, she said. I have answers. But first, I have one question for you. Yes? The report you filed this morning, the one that covered the management program records in full detail, including the Kepler intervention. Have you received any response from the council? Another pause. No, Vrenkai said. I have not. Nora sat back. That response tells you something. Silence on the channel, the thoughtful kind. I have been thinking the same thing, Vrenkai said finally, and his voice had shifted slightly, in a way that her translator matrix rendered as someone who has just made a decision that they know they cannot unmake. What would you like to discuss, Commander? Outside the observation window, the stars continued in their courses, indifferent and eternal. The 3 Accord patrol vessels still had not moved. The Leviathan still waited, patient as a calculation that has already reached its answer, and is simply waiting for the rest of the equation to catch up. Nora Calloway had spent 30 years working toward this moment, and she had imagined it in many forms, but she had not imagined it beginning like this. She had not imagined it beginning with an alien scientist, in a small observation post in the outer dark, who had read the same files she had read, who had understood them the same way she had understood them, and who was now doing the same thing she had done when she first understood what they meant. He was deciding what kind of person he was going to be about it. Let us start, she said, with what we know, and work from there. The channel stayed open. The Accord's council session continued its 33rd hour of debate. And in the space between all of it, something shifted, quietly and without announcement, the way important things often do. The Accord's 6 battlecruisers moved in formation. They were standard Accord military vessels, well-maintained, crewed by experienced officers, equipped with the weapons systems that had maintained galactic order for 2,000 years. They moved with precision, and with the particular confidence of an institution that had never in its recorded history encountered a situation that its military force could not manage. Their targeting systems locked onto the Leviathan at a distance of 40,000 kilometers. Their commanders broadcast a standard challenge order on the Accord's official military frequency. The challenge gave the Leviathan 30 seconds to respond with identification, authorization codes, and compliance with an escort-out order. Nora Calloway heard the challenge from her command station. She had been expecting it. She had expected it 32 hours earlier, which told her that the Council had spent an entire day, and more simply working up to a decision that its own doctrine said should have been automatic. Owen, she said. Ready, Commander. Do not fire first, she said. We will not fire first. Understood. If they fire, she said, the point defense grid responds automatically. You do not need to do anything. Yes, Commander. She looked at the tactical display. 6 vessels. She knew their weapon types, their range, their reload cycles, and the engineering principles behind every system they carried. She knew this because humanity had spent 30 years studying every piece of Accord military information that could be accessed, decoded, or reconstructed. It was not a pleasant thing to know about oneself, that you had spent 3 decades preparing to do what she was about to do. But preparation was what kept people alive, and people had not stayed alive long enough to build the Leviathan by being unprepared. The 30 seconds passed. The Leviathan did not respond with identification codes. It did not comply with the escort order. It simply sat where it was, the way it had been sitting for 33 hours. The point defense grid passive but ready, the reactor steady, the crew at their stations. The 6 cruisers fired. Nora had thought she was prepared for the next 11 seconds. She had run the models many times. She understood what the point defense grid was capable of. She had reviewed the engineering specifications with the teams that had built it, who had revised it, who had tested it in the asteroid belt against targets moving at speeds that made the cruiser's weapons look leisurely. She had thought she was prepared, but watching it happen in real time was different from a model, and what struck her most in those 11 seconds was not the efficiency, though the efficiency was extraordinary. What struck her was the sound. There was no sound in space, of course. But inside the Leviathan, the point defense activation produced a sequence of very precise, very rapid sounds from the fire control systems, clean and regular, and then it was over. 11 seconds. The cruisers had not been destroyed. Nora had been very specific about that in the mission parameters, because destroying them was not the goal. Their propulsion systems had been disabled with a precision that the engineering team had worked on for 4 years, specifically to be able to do exactly that, in exactly that way. The crews were unharmed. The vessels were intact. They were simply stopped, in space, unable to move under their own power, at 40,000 kilometers from the Leviathan. Nora opened the central relay channel to the Accord's council session. She spoke clearly, because the Accord's translation systems were good but not perfect, and she wanted there to be no ambiguity whatsoever about what she said. "This is Commander Nora Calloway of the Unsky Leviathan. Your vessels opened fire on us. We have disabled their propulsion systems without harming their crews. We will provide towing assistance to bring your crews to safety at a location of your choosing. This offer is unconditional and will remain open. We will now be transmitting a data package to all Accord member frequencies. The package contains records of all Accord interventions in the Sol system and its inhabited bodies over the past 800 years, including the operational records of the Developmental Management Division, the strategic assessments that authorized the management program, and the field reports of all interventions, including those conducted against human settlements. The package also contains our full mission brief, our intentions, and the terms we are proposing for a new framework of relations between humanity and the Accord's member species. We will await your response. We will wait as long as necessary." She closed the channel. Then she opened the secondary fleet channel. "All vessels, Commander Calloway. The Council has received the package. We are in the waiting phase. Maintain positions. Stay visible. Do not initiate contact with any Accord vessel. If anyone approaches you, respond with identification and the standard courtesy protocols we discussed. We are not here to frighten people. We are here to give them a clear picture of a situation and the space to make a choice about it." She received 14 acknowledgements in sequence, 14 ship commanders confirming positions across the strategic points of the galaxy's major infrastructure network. Then she switched back to the direct channel she had kept open to Theta 9. "Vrenkai," she said, "are you watching the Council feed?" "Yes," he said. He had been on the channel for most of the past 8 hours. They had talked a great deal, and it had been a remarkable series of conversations, the kind that happen when two people who have studied the same subject from opposite sides of a wall finally stand in the same room and compare notes. The package reached the central array 7 minutes ago. The Council session has gone quiet. Quiet? The kind of quiet, he said carefully. That happens when a room full of people have all just read the same thing and are individually processing what it means that they have read it. Nora found herself almost smiling, which was unusual for her in a professional context. "How long do you think before someone speaks?" "In my experience with Council dynamics," Vrenkai said, "someone will speak within the next few minutes. It will probably not be constructive. The constructive conversation will begin approximately 2 to 4 hours after that, depending on how long it takes for the initial reactive response to exhaust itself. That is a very precise prediction. I have attended many Council sessions." Nora looked at her tactical display. The 6 disabled cruisers were still at their positions. Their crews had not used emergency communication systems to call for assistance, which meant either they were in shock, or they were waiting to see what their Council said, or both. The data package was now propagating through every Accord communication network, which meant it was being read, right now, by every being with network access in a civilization of 32 species, spanning a significant portion of the galaxy. The information could not be unsent. The files could not be reburied. Every managed observation record, every sealed report, every carefully clinical description of an intervention that had ended human lives, was now available to anyone who wanted to read it. She had thought a great deal about this moment, about whether it was right to release it this way, suddenly and completely, rather than through some more gradual process. She had argued about it with her mission planning team for months. The argument for a more gradual approach was that it gave people time to adjust, time to process, time to respond, in a considered, rather than a reactive way. The argument against a gradual approach was that gradual release of information about wrongdoing was how wrongdoing continued. It was how a story got told with the worst parts softened by context, how responsibility got diffused through layers of interpretation until it was nobody's fault specifically, just the result of institutional processes and historical circumstances, the kind of thing that was unfortunate, but not something anyone needed to do anything about in practical terms. She had decided against gradual. She had decided for immediate and complete. The Accord's Council was right now either reading or about to read a full, unedited, uncontextualized record of what had been done, in the words of the people who had done it, with dates and names and authorization signatures. It was the kind of moment that could not be managed once it existed. Vrenkai's voice came back on the channel. "Someone has spoken. It is as I predicted, not constructive. There is a proposal being made for emergency powers to be invoked under the Accord's Crisis Management Charter. Emergency powers to do what? A pause. The proposal does not specify. Emergency powers under the Crisis Charter are quite broad. In theory, they could be used to authorize almost anything. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Sevra abstaining vote. And the other 8 species that abstained, have any of them responded to the package yet? Not through council channels, but I am seeing secondary network activity from those regions. They are talking to each other." He paused again, "And 2 of them appear to be attempting to reach your secondary fleet vessels." Nora looked at Owen. He was already tracking it. He nodded once. "The secondary fleet commanders have acknowledged contact and are following the standard courtesy protocol," Owen said. "No substantive communication yet, waiting for your authorization." Nora thought about Vrenkai's earlier question, the one he had asked in the 3rd hour of their conversation, when they had been deep into the records of the management program and its effects on developing civilizations across several sectors. He had asked her what humanity wanted. Not strategically, not tactically. What they actually wanted, as an outcome. What they were willing to accept as a definition of success for a mission that had taken 30 years to prepare and had involved a commitment of resources and human lives and individual sacrifice that he said he could not quite comprehend yet. She had told him the truth. She had told him that what humanity wanted was a galaxy where what happened to Kepler could not happen again, where the decision to quietly manage a civilization's development could not be made in a closed session by a body that answered to nobody outside itself and kept its records in archives behind 3 authorization overrides, where the species that were currently abstaining in council sessions because they had spent centuries learning to be very careful about which side of things they appeared to be on, could stop performing that careful calculation, because the system that made the calculation necessary would no longer exist. She had told him that humanity was not interested in replacing the Accord. Replacing it with humanity would simply be the same architecture with a different name at the top, and they had spent enough time on the wrong end of that architecture to understand exactly how it worked and why it did not produce the outcomes it claimed to be working toward. What they wanted was something different, something that had not existed before, in any form, in any of the 17 civilizations Vrenkai had watched. Something that would require the willing participation of species who had every reason to be suspicious of it, because their entire historical experience of galactic politics had been one form or another of being told that someone more powerful than them had their interests at heart, while demonstrably having nothing of the kind. It would not be easy. It would probably not work perfectly. It might fail in ways that were not predictable from here. But the Accord had also not been easy, and had also not worked perfectly, and had also failed in ways that were very predictable from the outside, if you read its own internal records, which its own internal records strongly suggested it preferred that nobody did. The council session had gone quiet again, according to Vrenkai's next update. The emergency powers proposal had not passed, not because enough members opposed it, but because 9 species had simply stopped participating in the session, which broke the quorum needed for any binding vote. 9 species had looked at the data package and made a calculation, and the calculation had produced a result that said, "We are not voting to give emergency powers to the body that just had its entire history of covert management made public to everyone." Nora looked at the stars through the forward window. The Leviathan breathed around her, the small sounds of a living ship, the hum and tick and rhythm of a vessel, built by people who were very serious about what they were doing. "Owen," she said, "authorize the secondary fleet commanders to accept communication requests from the abstaining species delegations. Standard courtesy protocols remain in effect. No commitments, no agreements, no negotiations. Just listen." "Yes, Commander." "And get me a channel to the 6 disabled cruisers. I want to speak to their commanders directly. Not through the council, directly." Owen looked at her again, with that question forming behind his careful eyes. She answered it before he asked it. "The commanders of those vessels made a decision today," she said. "They followed orders, which is what commanders do. But they followed orders that did not work out the way the orders expected, and now they are sitting in disabled ships, waiting to find out what happens to them. They are people in a difficult situation. We should speak to them as people in a difficult situation." Owen turned to his station. A minute later he said, 6 channels open, Commander. Nora leaned forward. 6 commanders, trained by an institution that had just had its foundational records made public to a galaxy, sitting in ships that a vessel from a species their institution had classified as negligible had disabled in 11 seconds, without harming a single member of their crews. She spoke to them the way she would have wanted someone to speak to her in a similar situation, clearly, without condescension, and with the straightforward acknowledgement that the situation they were all in was difficult and had not been created by any of them personally, and could still, with some effort and some honesty, be moved towards something better than what it currently was. One of the 6 commanders was silent for a long time after she finished. Then he said, in a voice that her translator rendered as cautious but not hostile, "You could have destroyed us." "Yes," Nora said. "Why did you not?" She thought about Kepler. She thought about the file behind 3 authorization overrides. She thought about 5,000 people in a settlement they had built with their own hands, and the clinical language of a field report, and the word guidance. "Because we did not come here to do to you what was done to us," she said. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then the commander said, "I would like to accept your offer of towing assistance, Commander Calloway." "We will send a shuttle immediately," she said. She closed the 6 channels and sat back in her seat. The waiting continued. It would continue for a while longer. That was fine. The Leviathan had been waiting in one form or another for 30 years, and the crew was very good at it. I sat in my observation chair at Theta 9 and listened to the sounds of a galaxy reorganizing itself. It did not sound dramatic. That was the first thing that surprised me. I had expected something louder, something that would feel proportionate to the scale of what was happening. Instead, what I heard and read in the feeds coming through my monitoring systems was quieter than almost any council session I had observed in 41 cycles. It was the sound of institutions discovering that the ground they had built themselves on was different from what they had believed it was, and trying to find their footing in a way that did not require them to fall over entirely. Nora Calloway and I had been talking for the better part of 4 days by that point. The conversations had shifted many times in character and direction. In the beginning they had been, on my side at least, partly an attempt to understand what was happening, and partly something that I could not name precisely, a process of looking at everything I had believed about my own work and my own institution, and testing each belief against the information in the data package, and in the files I had found behind the authorization overrides. Most of the beliefs did not survive the testing, not because I discovered I had been wrong in simple ways, but because I found something more unsettling, which was that I had been right in most of the particular facts, and wrong in the shape that those facts made, when you put them all together, and looked at them honestly. I had known that the Accord managed developing civilizations. I had known that managing them sometimes involved interventions that were not announced publicly. I had known that certain decisions made in closed sessions were not available for review by analysts at my level. I had filed reports into a system I understood to be self-correcting and self-honest, and I had believed, without examining the belief very carefully, that the system was what it said it was because the evidence I could see supported that, and I had not looked hard at the evidence I could not see, because nobody had asked me to, and I had not wanted to. That was the shape of the error. Not corruption, not malice on my part, just the ordinary human equivalent of a decision not to look at the difficult thing, made so many times that it became invisible, became simply the texture of how things were, became the water in which I swam, without noticing it was water. I say human equivalent because I had been spending 4 days talking to a human, and I had found their particular way of describing the categories of error that beings make very clear. They had spent a great deal of time studying the ways that groups of people convince themselves that what they are doing is acceptable. Nora had told me that this was one of the most important things humanity had learned in its history, because its history contained so many examples of what happened when that study was neglected. The data package had reached every corner of the Accord's network. I was receiving secondary feeds from Accord member worlds, independent monitoring stations, and 17 categories of news and commentary networks, and the picture they produced was consistent in ways that would have been remarkable if I had not understood why it was consistent. Everybody was shocked. Everybody, at some level, had not known. Not in the simple sense of ignorance. Many beings in the Accord had known pieces of the management program, had suspected things that the records had now confirmed, had heard informal accounts of interventions that they had filed away under the category of rumor or exaggeration. But knowing pieces of a thing, and suspecting a thing, and hearing rumor of a thing, is not the same as having the complete record placed in front of you in unedited form, authorized signatures intact, with the dates and names and clinical descriptions of outcomes that had happened to real beings in real places. The HFY delegation had reached the secondary fleet vessel positioned nearest their territory, 6 hours after the data package reached the Accord network. They had asked to speak with the vessel's commanding officer, a man named Gilbert Marsh, who was thoughtful and thorough in the way that Nora Calloway's crew consistently seemed to be. The HFY delegation had sent their second highest-ranking diplomat, which was a significant gesture in HFY diplomatic protocol. Their conversation had lasted 4 hours. Gilbert had listened more than he spoke, which I understood from what Nora had told me about mission protocols was entirely intentional. At the end of the 4 hours, the HFY diplomat had asked what humanity wanted. Gilbert had given them the same answer Nora had given me. Other abstaining species delegations were reaching out to other secondary fleet vessels, and similar conversations were occurring, each one 4 to 6 hours long, each one structured around listening, and each one ending with some version of the same question and the same answer. The council session had not formally reconvened. The quorum problem had not been resolved. The 11 species who had voted for military response were issuing statements through their own networks, and the statements were largely focused on the illegality of the Leviathan's presence, the unauthorized nature of the faster-than-light transit, and the violation of Accord's sovereign space. They were not addressing the contents of the data package. They had, collectively, chosen to respond to the container rather than the contents. Nora had told me this was the expected response pattern, and that it was not necessarily dishonest. Human psychology research suggested that when a large piece of information arrived that required a person or institution to revise fundamental beliefs about themselves, the first response was almost always to locate a procedural problem with the information's delivery, rather than engage with the information directly. It was a protection mechanism. It bought time. It gave the mind space to adjust before having to respond to the substance. The adjusting takes time, she had told me. We know that. We have planned for it. We are not in a hurry. The disabled cruisers had been towed to a neutral station by Leviathan shuttles. The commanders had spoken briefly with their fleet command, and then 2 of them had sent requests for continued communication with Commander Calloway. She had agreed. Those conversations were ongoing. I had spent some time thinking about what I was going to do, not about the immediate situation, because the immediate situation seemed to be resolving at the pace Nora had predicted, with or without my contribution. I had been thinking about what I was going to do with the rest of my professional existence, which seemed like a question that required some reconsideration, given that the institution I had spent that existence serving had turned out to be something different from what I had believed it was. I had talked to Nora about this directly. She had not offered easy comfort, which I found I preferred over easy comfort, because easy comfort would have required her to tell me that I was not responsible for what I had been part of, and I was not certain that was entirely true, and I did not want to be told something comforting that was not entirely true. What she had said was more interesting. She had said that the question of what to do with knowledge about an error was not the same as the question of who was responsible for the error. Those were 2 separate questions, and they were often confused with each other in ways that made both harder to answer. Being responsible for something, in whole or in part, did not determine what you did next. What you did next was a different choice, made from a different position, and it was possible to make a good choice from a bad position if you were honest about where you were standing. She had also said that the compact they were proposing, the new framework to replace the Accord, would need a Secretary of Historical Record, someone who had the access, the training, and the personal motivation to build an archive of what the Accord had actually been, in full, without the careful language and the closed sessions and the authorization overrides. Someone who would maintain a record that was read, understood, and publicly available, so that the error of not looking at the difficult thing could not repeat itself, at least not from institutional ignorance. She had not offered me the position. She had simply described it, and then let the silence sit, in the way that someone lets a silence sit when they have said what they mean, and are waiting to see if the other person has heard it. I had heard it. I had not responded immediately. I was still sitting with it when the council feed produced something new. One of the previously abstaining species had just broken from the abstaining group and voted against the emergency powers proposal that had been retabled in a modified form. Then 2 more followed. Then the remaining 6, one after another, in a sequence that suggested they had discussed this and made a collective decision about which way to move. The emergency powers proposal failed, definitively and finally. In the council chamber, the first constructive conversation began. It was not smooth. It was not graceful. It was the kind of conversation that happens when beings who have never had to justify themselves to each other suddenly find themselves in a room where justification is required, and some of them are good at it, and some of them are not, and all of them are afraid of slightly different things for slightly different reasons. But it was the conversation, the real one, the one that was about the substance rather than the container. I watched it through the summary feeds, and I noticed something that I wanted to record, because I thought it was important for someone to have noticed it. The beings who spoke most clearly and most constructively in that session were the ones from the 9 abstaining species. They had spent a very long time being careful about what they said in formal settings, and that careful practice had given them a precision in language and an economy in statement that made every word they said count. They said less than the dominant species, and they meant more by it. And after 4 hours, the tone of the conversation had shifted significantly toward what they were saying and away from the procedural arguments that had been dominating. I found this instructive in ways that I would have some time to think about. Nora's voice came through my channel. "Are you watching the session?" "Yes," I said. "The Accord's structure is not going to survive in its current form," she said. It was not a prediction delivered with satisfaction. It was a clinical observation delivered by someone who had planned for this outcome, but understood that it was still something happening to real beings in a real situation. That is not a bad thing, but it is a disruptive thing, and disruption has costs. "I know," I said. "How are you doing?" It was a simple question, and I realized I had not been asked it in a long time. My observation post was not the kind of posting where people ask that question. It was the kind of posting where professional performance was monitored, and personal state was assumed to be within acceptable parameters, as long as the reports kept coming in accurately and on time. "I am processing," I said, which was true, and then I added, "I have been thinking about the position you described." A pause. "And?" "I think," I said, "that whoever does that work needs to be someone who is capable of being honest about their own role in what they are documenting. Not in a way that makes the record about them, but in a way that does not pretend they were standing outside it." "That is what I think too," Nora said. "It is a very large task." "Yes. The archive would need to be comprehensive, not just the management program records. The complete operational history of the Accord from its founding, including the periods before the management program, to understand the conditions that produced it, including the extinction reports filed by observation analysts over the centuries." I paused. "Including mine." "Especially yours," Nora said, "because you have direct access to your own methodology and your own reasoning in ways that a later historian reviewing records would not." I sat with this for a moment. It would require the cooperation of the new governing body. Whatever emerges from the process that is currently beginning in the council chambers. "We are prepared to make it a founding condition of the compact," she said, "that the historical archive exists, is maintained independently, and is publicly accessible. No closed sessions for the record, no authorization overrides, no low-priority classifications to bury things that make the institution uncomfortable. That is a significant commitment. We are serious about it." I thought about Paris Dale, the analyst who had warned about humanity's pattern recognition abilities 800 years ago and had been transferred to a different sector for her trouble. I thought about her final assessment and the line I had read 3 times. I thought about what it would mean for that line to exist in an accessible archive where any being with a reason to look could find it, rather than buried in a secondary storage layer behind a senior clearance requirement. "I would like to come aboard the Leviathan," I said. A longer pause than usual. "Then, we will send a shuttle." The Leviathan at close range was something different from the Leviathan on a sensor display. I had been observing it for days, and I had built a picture in my mind from the data, and the picture was accurate in its measurements, but not in its character. Standing at the observation port of the shuttle as it approached the docking bay, I understood something that sensor readings do not convey, which is the difference between a thing that was made and a thing that was built. The Accord's vessels were made. They were products of industrial processes that had been refined over centuries, optimized for efficiency and standardization, produced in large numbers by systems that could replicate them without significant variation. They were excellent vessels. They functioned as intended. There was nothing wrong with them except that they were expressions of a civilization that had reached a state of refinement, where the optimized version of everything was also the obvious version, and the obvious version left no trace of the choices made in its construction. The Leviathan had been built. There were decisions in it, choices made at specific moments by specific people who had been solving specific problems with the resources and knowledge available to them, and who had made those choices in an environment where there was no established template for what they were trying to do. The hull showed this. The external configurations of the weapon systems showed it. The docking bay entrance, as the shuttle passed through it, showed it in the engineering solutions visible in every structural element, solutions that were not always elegant, but were always deliberate. It looked like something made by a civilization that had been figuring things out under pressure for a very long time and had become very good at exactly that. Lieutenant Owen Hart met me at the docking bay. He was younger than I had expected from his voice in the communication feeds, and he had the quality of attention that I associated with people who had been trained to notice the things that most people do not notice. He greeted me with a courtesy that was direct without being formal, which I had come to understand in the past few days was a characteristic style among the Leviathan's crew. "Analyst Vren Kai," he said. "Welcome. Commander Calloway will meet you in the primary conference room. I will take you there." The walk through the Leviathan took 12 minutes, and I spent most of it looking. The crew members we passed were going about their work with the same quality of focused attention that Owen had. Nobody stopped to observe me, though several acknowledged my presence with small gestures of greeting. The interior of the vessel was not decorated. It was functional in a way that had its own aesthetic, the aesthetic of things arranged for purpose, where the arrangement itself became the statement. We passed through a section of the ship that appeared to be a recreation area. Several crew members were eating. One group was engaged in a game I did not recognize. A woman with gray at her temples was sitting in a chair, reading from a physical book, which I found remarkable as a choice given the available technology. She looked up briefly as we passed, nodded at Owen, and returned to her book. It looked, I thought, like a community. Not a unit, not a crew in the operational sense. A community of people who had chosen to be here together, and who had built the internal culture of the vessel around that choice. Owen led me into the conference room. Nora Calloway was already there, standing at a window that showed a view of space I had been observing from the other direction for days. She was taller than I had approximated from the communication feeds, and she had the quality of physical stillness that I associated with people for whom stillness was a trained discipline rather than a natural default. She turned when I entered and looked at me with direct attention that I found easier to meet than I expected. "Vren Kai," she said. "It is very good to finally see you in person." "And you, Commander," I said. We sat across a table from each other. Owen stood near the door, present but not obtrusive. The conference room had a long window on one side and walls that held no decoration, except a series of technical displays, currently showing the status feeds from across the fleet and the council session. I looked at the council session feed. The constructive conversation I had observed beginning from my station was continuing. One of the SEV-RA delegates was speaking. The translation feed indicated that she was proposing a formal mechanism for historical review, which was exactly what Nora had described to me as a founding condition of the compact. "They are proposing it themselves," I said. Nora nodded. "We hoped they might. It carries more weight as a proposal from the existing member species than as a demand from us. Did you suggest it to them in your conversations with their delegation?" She looked at me with something that I translated as appreciation. We described the outcome we were hoping for. We were explicit that a formal historical review mechanism was part of it. We did not tell them to propose it. We trusted them to see the logic themselves. "There is a difference." "Yes," she said. "There is. It matters." I thought about this distinction between creating the conditions for something and engineering the outcome, and how the difference between those two things was exactly what the management program had failed to maintain. The management program had started with conditions and ended with engineering, because the institution implementing it had no mechanism that required it to ask, regularly and honestly, whether what it was doing had crossed that line. "I have a question for you," I said. "Of course. The data package, the full operational records, how did you obtain them?" Nora was quiet for a moment. It was not an evasive quiet. It was the quiet of someone deciding how detailed to be. 30 years ago, she said, we identified a pattern of anomalies in the Accord's administrative signals that came through frequencies we should not have been able to read. We were not supposed to have technology capable of receiving those frequencies. We had developed it independently, approximately 40 years ahead of the projection curves in the developmental models. She paused. For the first 12 years, we simply recorded what we received. We were decoding it. It took time. The language and encoding systems were unlike anything in human experience. "And then you understood what you were reading." "And then we understood what we were reading," she confirmed. "Yes. And at that point, the question of what to do became a different kind of question from the one we had been asking before." "What had you been asking before?" "Whether we were alone," she said simply. "After we understood what we were reading, the question changed to, what kind of galaxy are we entering, and what do we want to do about it?" I sat with this. The 30 years of preparation followed. "Yes. You planned to do this for 30 years. We planned to be ready to do this," she said, with a precision that I understood was meaningful. "We did not plan the specific events of the past 5 days. We planned for a range of possible responses, and prepared for each of them. We hoped for the response we seem to be getting, which involves a significant number of member species concluding that the status quo is not something they want to maintain. We prepared for responses that would have required different approaches. And if the response had been immediate, full military engagement from all Accord forces," she looked at me. "We would have been fine," she said, in a tone that carried no pride, only a practical assessment. "But the question is not whether we would have survived. The question is what would have survived with us. The outcome we want requires that enough of the existing structure remain intact to be reformed rather than replaced from zero. Replacement from zero is slower, more painful, and produces a higher likelihood of the same errors reproducing because there is no institutional memory to learn from." She paused. "We are not interested in burning things down. We are interested in examining them honestly and rebuilding what cannot survive the examination with something that can." I thought of the 11 extinction reports I had filed. I thought about what it would mean for those files to be part of a comprehensive archive that was genuinely examined, whether any of those civilizations had disappeared entirely naturally, or whether some of them had received guidance of the kind that the Kepler colony had received. I did not know the answer. I suspected I might not want to know it, but I understood, sitting across from Nora Calloway, that not wanting to know it was exactly the kind of feeling that needed to be examined, rather than accommodated. "About the position," I said. "Yes. I will do it," I said, "on the condition that I have complete access to all records held by both the Accord and humanity, and that my findings are published without editorial review by any governing body." Nora did not hesitate. "Agreed. Including records that reflect poorly on humanity." A pause. "Including those." "There will be some," I said. "No civilization that prepares for conflict for 30 years does so without making decisions they would not want in an accessible archive." She looked at me steadily. "I know that." "And you still agree?" "We cannot build what we are trying to build on selective honesty," she said. "That is precisely the lesson we have learned from everything we have been reading for 30 years. Selective honesty is where it begins. It is a very short road from there to where the Accord ended up." I nodded slowly. "Then we are in agreement." Owen, from near the door, said quietly, "Commander, the council session feed." We both looked at the display. The Sevra delegate had finished her proposal. The vote on whether to formally adopt a historical review mechanism as a principle had just been called. I had spent 41 cycles watching councils vote on things, and I had developed a sense for how votes moved before they were formally recorded, a reading of the hesitation and the body language and the communication patterns that preceded the final count. This vote was not going to be close. Nora seemed to sense the same thing, because she sat back slightly in her chair and let out a breath that I understood was not quite relief but something adjacent to it, the release of something that has been held for a very long time and is finally, carefully, being set down. "How do you feel?" I asked her, using her own question back to her. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the council feed as the votes came in. "Like something is beginning," she said. "Not ending. Beginning." The vote completed. The historical review mechanism was adopted as a founding principle of the proposed Compact of Recognized Worlds. 41 of the Accord's member species had voted in favor, 4 had abstained, none had voted against. Outside the Leviathan's window, the stars continued in their courses, the same as they had always been, but the way they were organized, the meaning they held, the map of who lived among them and how, was shifting in a way that would take years to fully understand. I made a note in my private log. It said, "This is what it looks like when the shape of things changes." Not an explosion, not a sudden reversal, just beings deciding, one after another, that the ground they were standing on was worth examining honestly, and that what came after the examination, whatever it was worth the discomfort of getting there. Then I opened a new file, labeled it Founding Records, and began to write. 10 years. In the life of a galaxy, 10 years is nothing, a breath, a footnote in the margin of a process so long that the beings alive at its beginning would not recognize the ones alive at its end. I know this better than most, because documenting the life of civilizations across centuries is the work I have been doing, and I have learned to hold time lightly, to understand that what feels like a long period within it is usually just a single note in a very long piece of music. But 10 years is long enough to see whether something that was planted has taken root, long enough to know whether the decision made in that conference room on the Leviathan, and in the Accord Council chambers in the days following, was the beginning of something real, or only the beginning of a better version of the same mistake. My name is still Vrenkai. I am the Secretary of Historical Record for the Compact of Recognized Worlds, and I work in an office that I have filled with files in the way that someone fills a space when they intend to remain in it. The office is on the Compact's capital station, which orbits a planet at the gravitational center of the region, where the most species overlap in their territorial claims, which was chosen for that reason rather than for any aesthetic value. It is not a beautiful location, but it is a fair one, and fairness was the criterion that the founding charter specified, which I thought was a good sign. The archive is large. I had not fully appreciated how large it would be before I began it. The Accord's operational records alone, fully unredacted, span a period of more than 10,000 years. Adding the records of humanity's 30-year preparation project, and the internal records of each of the Compact's 46 member species, and the ongoing records of the Compact itself, produces something that is less a document and more a territory. I have a staff of 11 researchers, representing 7 different species, and we work on it every day, and every day we find something we did not know was there. Some of what we find is difficult. I was correct that humanity's preparation period contained decisions that did not survive examination easily. There were resource acquisition methods that hurt communities who did not know they were being affected. There were communication intercept programs that violated what most of the Compact's founding species would have called basic standards of privacy. There were internal disagreements within humanity's planning councils that were resolved in ways that prioritized mission success over the well-being of individual people who were part of the mission. Nora Calloway, who is now Earth's ambassador to the Compact, and who I speak with regularly, reviews these findings the way she reviews everything, with direct attention and without defensiveness. When the archive published the record of the intercept programs, she gave a formal statement to the Compact's general session acknowledging them and describing the review process humanity had conducted internally. When the record of the resource acquisition methods was published, the human delegation proposed and funded a remediation effort for the communities affected. This is not the same as those things not having happened. It is not an erasure. The record exists. It will continue to exist. Anyone who wants to read it can read it, and anyone who reads it will find both what was done and what was done afterward, and they can form their own assessment of what both things mean and whether they are sufficient. That is what the archive is for. Not to make anything acceptable, to make it known. The Leviathan is in permanent orbit above the capital station, not as a threat, though it remains the largest and most capable vessel in any fleet the Compact's member species possess. And this fact is known to everyone. It is there as the anchor of something. When the founding charter was ratified, Commander Calloway was asked to say a few words. She said that the Leviathan would remain in orbit as a monument and as a reminder, as a monument to the people who built it and everything that had made its building necessary, as a reminder that the civilization that built it had once been classified as negligible, self-destructive, and pre-spaceflight, and that this classification had been the product of an institution that had invested more in maintaining its certainties than in examining them honestly. She did not say this with anger. She said it the way she says most things, clearly and without decoration, in a tone that is not asking for anything from the listener, only offering them the information and letting them decide what to do with it. The compact has 46 member species. It will probably have more, because the logic of membership is straightforward, and the alternative is to remain outside a framework that most beings, once they understand it fully, find more appealing than the alternative. The governing structure is not simple, and it is not always efficient, because simplicity and efficiency in governance tend to produce the same outcome, which is that the most powerful entities in the system gradually simplify the structure further in ways that happen to concentrate authority near themselves, and efficiency is invoked to justify each simplification, and the end result is familiar. The compact is designed to be slow, deliberately slow, in the specific ways that protect the smaller member species from having decisions made for them at speeds they cannot engage with. This is frustrating. There are council sessions that go for 12 days, because the consensus process requires that every member with a concern about a proposal be given adequate time to articulate it and have it addressed. There are proposals that have been under discussion for 3 years and are not close to a final vote. There are beings who find this maddening and say so loudly and often. Nora and I agree that the frustration is healthy. The frustration is what a decision-making body looks like when it cannot simply override the members who slow it down. The frustration is evidence that the slowing down mechanism is working. The Accord was very efficient. It could make decisions quickly and implement them across the entire galaxy in days when the situation required it. Several of those efficient decisions are in the archive, and reading them is educational. Owen Hart runs the Compact's Peacekeeping Coordination Office. He is very good at it, because his particular form of careful attention turns out to be exactly what is needed for a role that requires noticing the small problems before they become large ones, and addressing them with precision rather than force. He contacts me occasionally to discuss historical precedents for the situations he encounters. I find these conversations useful because they are one of the clearest tests of what the archive is for, which is to be actually used by people making actual decisions in the actual present. Fessa Ran, the colleague who first noticed the timing pattern in the Leviathan's broadcast, is now a senior analyst in my department. She noticed that pattern from a different monitoring post, while simultaneously processing 11 other data feeds, which I told her was exactly the quality of attention the archive needed, and that she should consider whether she wanted to do something with it that was not waiting for councils to respond to reports. She considered it for about 4 days and then accepted the offer. Gilbert Marsh commands the Compact's Joint Patrol Fleet, which is composed of vessels from 12 different member species and is very deliberately not dominated by any one of them, including humanity. The joint structure is complicated to operate and requires constant negotiation among the 12 contributing species about protocols and command hierarchies and resource allocation. Gilbert manages this with a patience that I find remarkable, and that he tells me is simply a result of having learned that you cannot rush the process of building trust, and that any shortcut you take in that building will produce a gap that shows up at exactly the wrong moment. Nora and I have dinner once a month when our schedules permit, which is not always, because her schedule is extraordinary, and mine has become more complicated than I anticipated when I took this position. We eat in the Compact's visitor dining hall, at a table near a window that shows the station's outer docking ring, and we talk about things that are not directly related to our work, because we have both found that talking about things not directly related to your work is an important part of doing your work well. Last month she asked me what I thought the archive would look like in 100 years. I thought about it for a while. The archive in 100 years will contain the entire record of the Compact's first century, alongside the full record of everything that preceded it. It will be larger. It will be more complex. It will contain things that nobody in that future period will be comfortable reading, because no century of any civilization produces a record that is entirely comfortable to read. The question is not whether the record will contain uncomfortable things. The question is whether the record will be accessible and whether the people reading it will be the ones making decisions about what comes next. I told her that what I hoped the archive would look like in 100 years was used, consulted regularly by the beings making decisions about how things should work, referenced in council sessions, read by young people in the educational systems of all 46 member species, argued about, because anything worth keeping is worth arguing about, and the fact that something produces argument is not evidence that it should be hidden, but evidence that it contains something that matters. She said she thought that was a good answer. I told her I had been thinking about Paris Dale, the analyst from 800 years ago who had filed the report about humanity's pattern recognition abilities and been transferred to a different sector for it. I had found her complete records during my second year of archive work. She had spent the rest of her career at a low-priority monitoring post, filing accurate reports that were consistently given low-priority classifications, and she had retired without further incident or commendation. Her final personal log, which was not an official document, but which had been preserved in a secondary archive with her other professional files, contained a single line about humanity. She wrote that she had spent 50 years watching a species learn to navigate around walls, and that she believed it would eventually run out of walls to navigate around, and that when it did, whatever it found on the other side would determine what kind of universe the galaxy turned out to be. I had included this in the archive with a note of my own. She was right. She was right 50 years before anyone was ready to believe her. The record exists. She will not be forgotten. Nora was quiet when I told her this. Then she said that the most important thing an archive could do was give the right people their names back. The ones who had noticed things and been ignored. The ones who had said the difficult thing and been moved to lower priority postings. The ones whose accuracy had been inconvenient and whose inconvenience had been responded to by the institution finding somewhere quieter for them to be. I thought that was the best description I had heard of what the work was for. Outside the dining hall window, the station's docking ring was active, with the ordinary business of 46 species, maintaining the infrastructure of something that had not existed 10 years ago, and that nobody fully understood yet, but that most beings who were part of it had decided was worth the effort of understanding. Ships came in and went out. Communications passed through relay points that were maintained by joint crews representing 4 or 5 species working together, which produced occasional coordination difficulties and occasional moments of genuine collaboration that neither species could have produced alone. It was not perfect. It was not clean or simple or efficient. It was large and complicated, and still discovering what it was, and the people inside it were still working out how to be inside it in a way that honored both what they had individually brought to it and what it required of them collectively. That is what it looks like when something is real rather than ideal. Real things are complicated. Real things produce friction and require adjustment, and sometimes move backward before they move forward. The accord had been simple and efficient, and had produced a record that I am spending the rest of my professional life documenting honestly, one suppressed report at a time. I will take the complicated version. I will take it with both hands, and I will file the record of every difficult day in it, with the same care that I file the record of every good one, because the record is not for celebrating the good days. The record is for making sure that the difficult days are understood, by whoever comes next, as the price of what the good days cost. The Leviathan sits in orbit and watches, patient as it has always been, quiet in the way that things are quiet when they have already done the work they were built to do, and are now simply present, as evidence of what became possible when the right people decided that the universe they were living in was not the only version of it that could exist. I open the archive every morning, and I add to it, and every morning I remember a line from Paris Dale's final log, and I hold it like the thread it was always meant to be, the one that ran through 800 years of careful non-looking and connected the moment someone first decided not to look at the difficult thing to the moment someone finally did. A civilization that teaches itself to navigate around obstacles it cannot see will eventually learn to navigate around all obstacles. She was right, and the record says so, and the record is open to anyone who wants to read it. That is enough. For today, that is enough.